The streets buzzed with the hymn of life, just like any other day in the city. People hurried along sidewalks, juggling coffee cups, briefcases, and the weight of their own worries. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden haze over the bustling urban landscape. No one knew that this ordinary day would unravel into a shocking story, one that would challenge justice, perception, and the very fabric of fairness. Officer Travis Carter stood tall, his crisp uniform gleaming under the sunlight. To passers-by, he looked like the embodiment of authority and duty, but inside, his mind raced with the usual frustrations of the job. It had been a long week of dealing with petty disputes, parking violations, and a string of small-time offenders who never seemed to learn. Travis had his own biases, though he never admitted them aloud, even to himself. Today was just another day, until it wasn't. On the other side of the city, Judge Marcus Steele wrapped up a particularly grueling court session. Known for his sharp intellect and unshakable sense of justice, Marcus had become a respected figure in both the legal community and his neighborhood. He wasn't just a judge, he was a symbol of hope for those who believed the system could work, even when it seemed stacked against them. Despite his prestige, Marcus preferred simplicity. He drove an old sedan, wore understated suits, and often walked through his neighborhood to connect with the people he served. As Marcus left the courthouse, he decided to take the scenic route home. It was his way of unwinding, a brief escape from the pressures of the bench. He strolled past local businesses, nodding at familiar faces and soaking in the vibrant energy of the streets he loved. But as he turned onto a quieter road, the atmosphere shifted. A police cruiser crawled to a stop nearby, and Marcus instinctively glanced in its direction. Officer Carter eyed Marcus from his patrol car. To Travis, Marcus looked like just another man, ordinary, unassuming, and in his eyes, suspicious. There was no reason to stop him, no crime committed, no call for assistance. But in that moment, Travis made a decision that would set off a chain of events neither of them could have anticipated. He stepped out of his car, his hand already resting on the taser strapped to his belt. "Sir, can I speak with you for a moment?" Travis's voice was calm but carried an undertone of authority that demanded compliance. Marcus turned, surprised by the sudden interruption. "Of course, officer. Is something wrong?" His voice was steady, his demeanor respectful. Years on the bench had taught him the importance of remaining composed, even in unexpected situations. Travis approached, his eyes scanning Marcus from head to toe. "What are you doing in this area?" Marcus raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor faltering slightly. "I'm walking home. Is there an issue?" For a moment, there was silence, the kind that stretches thin and tightens like a rope. Travis's hand tightened around the taser. He didn't hear Marcus's words as a man offering an explanation. He heard defiance where there was none. He saw a threat that didn't exist. "I need you to step aside and answer a few questions," Travis said, his tone sharper now. Marcus hesitated. He had spent decades upholding the law, presiding over cases where actions like this often led to disastrous outcomes. He knew his rights, but he also understood the delicate balance of navigating such encounters. "Officer, I've done nothing wrong. If you'd like, I can provide identification." Travis didn't like the pushback, no matter how measured it was. "Are you refusing to comply?" His voice rose, drawing the attention of a couple of onlookers across the street. "No, I'm not refusing," Marcus said firmly. "But I'd like to understand why I'm being stopped." Before Marcus could reach for his wallet, everything happened in a blur. Travis, already on edge, made a split-second decision that would haunt him for years to come. The taser was deployed, its sharp crack slicing through the air. Marcus staggered, his body convulsing as electricity surged through him. He collapsed onto the pavement, his face twisted in pain and disbelief. The crowd that had begun to gather gasped in shock. Phones were pulled out, recording the scene as it unfolded. Someone shouted, "What are you doing?" He didn't do anything. But their words were drowned out by the chaos. Travis stood frozen, his own heart pounding as he tried to justify what had just happened. To him, Marcus was just another man who had refused to obey, a narrative that he had seen play out too many times on the job. But as Marcus struggled to sit up, his voice breaking through the haze, those watching would soon realize that this wasn't just another confrontation. Unjudged Marcus Steele, Marcus gasped, his voice hoarse but unmistakably commanding. And you've made a terrible mistake. The weight of those words hung heavy in the air. Travis's face drained of color as the gravity of his actions began to sink in. Around them, the crowd murmured, their phones still recording, capturing every second of the encounter that would soon go viral. But this was only the beginning. The fallout from this moment would ripple far beyond this quiet street, shaking the foundations of justice, accountability, and trust. The street seemed to hold its breath. People exchanged wide-eyed glances, their murmurs mixing with the sound of Marcus's labored breathing. Travis took a step back, his mind racing. His grip on the taser loosened, but his heart pounded harder with every passing second. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Not here, not now, and certainly not with someone like this. Judge Marcus Steele. The name echoed in Travis's head, each syllable heavier than the last. He had heard that name before, that he couldn't immediately place it. It was a name that carried weight, authority, and now undeniable consequence. But what hit Travis even harder was the realization that every person standing on that sidewalk had captured what just happened. It wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. It was a public spectacle, one that would soon spiral far beyond his control. Marcus pushed himself up onto one elbow, his face a mixture of pain and disbelief. He locked eyes with Travis, who still hadn't moved. Do you even understand what you've done? Marcus's voice was low but steady, cutting through the tension like a knife. Travis opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He felt trapped, like the world was closing in around him. In the pit of his stomach, he knew that this wasn't going to end when he filed his report at the precinct. It wasn't even going to end in court. This moment would follow him for the rest of his life. Meanwhile, the crowd had grown. Someone in the back yelled, "He's a judge, man. You're done." Others stayed silent, watching as if they couldn't believe what they'd just witnessed. A young woman in a red jacket knelt beside Marcus, offering him a hand. "Are you okay, sir?" she asked softly. "I'll be fine," Marcus replied, his voice calmer than anyone expected. He accepted her help and sat upright, brushing dirt from his jacket. But this shouldn't have happened. The woman glanced at Travis with a mixture of fear and anger before pulling out her phone. "Do you want me to call someone? An ambulance?" Marcus shook his head. "No, thank you. But I would appreciate if you stayed here as a witness." Her eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. "Of course." Travis finally found his voice, though it was shaky. "Sir, I didn't know who you were." Marcus's gaze hardened. "And if I weren't a judge, what then? Would that make this acceptable?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Travis looked down at his hands, still trembling. He thought back to his training, the countless scenarios drilled into him during academy days. But none of that prepared him for this. He had acted on instinct. Or was it something darker, something he didn't want to admit to himself? As the tension between the two men crackled like static, the distant sound of sirens filled the air. Someone must have called for backup. Or maybe an ambulance after all. Travis felt his chest tighten. How would he explain this to his colleagues? To his superiors? To the world? Marcus, on the other hand, felt a different kind of pressure. He had spent his entire career navigating the delicate balance between justice and humanity. He knew how quickly narratives could shift, how easily facts could be twisted. He could already imagine the headlines. Asterisk respected judge wrongfully tased by police officer. Asterisk. But he also knew that his title wouldn't protect him from public scrutiny. People would dissect his every move, question why he had been there, what he had said, how he had reacted. And for all his composure, Marcus couldn't shake the sting of what had just happened. The sharp pain in his chest wasn't just from the taser. It was from the realization that even he, with all his accomplishments, wasn't immune to the biases that permeated the very system he worked to uphold. The sirens grew louder, and moments later, 2 police cruisers pulled up, lights flashing. Officers stepped out, their faces a mix of confusion and concern. One of them, a woman with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, approached cautiously. "What's going on here?" Travis stiffened, his voice cracking as he began to speak. "There was an incident. I stopped him." It gestured toward Marcus. "And?" The female officer cut him off with a raised hand. "Sir, are you okay?" she asked, addressing Marcus directly. "I'll live," Marcus replied, his tone clipped. "But I'd like to know why your colleague felt the need to use force without cause." The officer's eyes flicked to Travis, then back to Marcus. "We'll get this sorted out, sir. Do you need medical attention?" "No," Marcus said firmly, "but I will need names, badge numbers, and reports from everyone involved." The woman nodded, already pulling out her notepad. "Understood." As the officers began gathering information, the crowd started to disperse, though many lingered on the edges still recording. Travis felt the weight of their stares, their silent judgment. He wanted to disappear, to rewind time and make a different choice. But it was too late for that now. Marcus stood, brushing off the last of the dirt from his clothes. He looked directly at Travis, his expression unreadable. "You'll hear from me again," he said quietly. "And when you do, I hope you'll think about what led us to this moment." With that, Marcus turned and walked away, leaving Travis standing there, his world unraveling. As Marcus disappeared into the distance, Travis felt a hand on his shoulder. It was the female officer, her expression stern. "We'll need your full statement, Officer Carter. And I suggest you start thinking very carefully about what you're going to say." Travis nodded numbly, his mind a whirlwind of regret, fear, and confusion. He glanced down the street, where Marcus had just been. The judge's words echoed in his mind, louder than the sirens or the murmurs of the crowd. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. And deep down, he knew it never would be. Travis sat in the dimly lit precinct, his hands folded tightly on the desk in front of him. The room buzzed with activity. Phones ringing, officers moving about, snippets of conversations blending into an incoherent hum. But all Travis could hear was Judge Marcus Steele's voice replaying in his mind. His chest felt heavy, like a weight he couldn't shake off. Across the desk, Sergeant Wilkes, a burly man with a grizzled beard and piercing eyes, leaned forward, his fingers steepled. "You realize what you've done, don't you?" Wilkes' tone wasn't angry, but it carried the kind of disappointment that hit harder than a reprimand. Travis nodded stiffly. "I panicked. I thought." His voice trailed off. What had he thought? The truth was, he hadn't been thinking at all. He had let his assumptions take over, let fear cloud his judgment. But none of that mattered now. The damage was done. Wilkes let out a long sigh, rubbing a hand over his face. "This isn't just a PR nightmare. This is career-ending, Travis. Do you understand that? You taste a sitting judge, one of the most respected in the city, without any justifiable cause. This isn't going to go away quietly." Travis swallowed hard. "I didn't know who he was." "That's not an excuse," Wilkes snapped, his voice sharp for the first time. "It shouldn't matter who he was. Your job is to assess the situation, not act on instinct alone." Travis opened his mouth to respond, but stopped when another officer entered the room, handing Wilkes a thick file. The sergeant flipped it open, scanning the contents briefly before sliding it across the desk to Travis. "That's Judge Steele's file. Take a good look at the man you just assaulted." Reluctantly, Travis picked up the file and began flipping through the pages. Marcus Steele's face stared back at him from a photo attached to the first page. His eyes, even in the picture, carried the same quiet intensity that had unnerved Travis during their encounter. The file detailed Steele's long career. His rise from a public defender to one of the city's most esteemed judges, his involvement in community outreach programs, and the numerous awards he had received for his work in advocating for fairness in the justice system. It was impossible to ignore the stark contrast between the man in the file and the assumptions Travis had made in those critical seconds on the street. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in his modest home office, surrounded by stacks of legal documents and framed photos of his family. His wife, Angela, watched him from the doorway, her arms crossed. She hadn't said much since he walked through the door earlier, but her silence was louder than any words could have been. Finally, she spoke. "You're going to press charges, aren't you?" Marcus looked up, meeting her gaze. "I don't know yet." Angela's eyebrows shot up. "You don't know. Marcus, he tastes you. On the street. In broad daylight. And for what? For existing in the wrong place at the wrong time." "I know," Marcus said quietly, his hands clasped tightly together. "Believe me, I know. But pressing charges is only part of the equation. This is bigger than me, Angela. It's about what this represents." Angela stepped into the room, her voice rising. "Exactly. And that's why you need to act. If you don't, what kind of message does that send? To the people who look up to you? To the ones who've been in your position and didn't have the privilege of a title to shield them?" Marcus exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. She was right, of course. He had spent years fighting for justice, trying to reform a system that often felt broken beyond repair. But now, faced with the very thing he had worked so hard to change, he'd found himself paralyzed. Was it fear, doubt, or something deeper, an unwillingness to confront the reality that even he, with all his power and influence, wasn't safe from the biases that plagued society? Across the city, the incident had already begun to ripple outward. Social media was ablaze with videos of the confrontation, accompanied by hashtags like #JusticeForMarcus and #PoliceAccountability. News outlets picked up the story, dissecting every angle. Pundits debated on live television, some condemning Trevor's actions outright, others attempting to justify his decision as a split-second judgment call in a high-pressure situation. The public was divided, as it often was in such cases, but one thing was clear. This was more than just another headline. It was a flashpoint in an ongoing conversation about race, power, and the role of law enforcement. Back at the precinct, Travis sat in an interrogation room, this time as the subject rather than the enforcer. Internal affairs had been called in, and two investigators. One a stern-looking woman in her 40s, the other a younger man with a notepad, sat across from him. The woman, Agent Ramirez, wasted no time getting to the point. "Officer Carter, walk us through what happened," she said, her pen poised to take notes. Travis shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I saw him walking down the street. He looked out of place." Ramirez raised an eyebrow. "Out of place? How so?" Travis hesitated. He knew how it would sound, how it already sounded in his own head. He looked like he didn't belong in that neighborhood. "And what does someone who doesn't belong look like, Officer Carter?" Ramirez asked, her tone sharp. Travis felt his face flush. "I don't know. It was just a feeling." Ramirez exchanged a glance with her colleague before leaning forward. "Officer, do you understand the implications of what you just said? A feeling isn't probable cause. A feeling doesn't justify the use of force." Travis's shoulders slumped. "I know. I wasn't thinking. I made a mistake." "A mistake?" Ramirez repeated, her voice incredulous. "Officer, this wasn't just a mistake. This was a serious lapse in judgment, one that could have cost a man his life. Do you understand that?" Travis nodded, but his silence spoke volumes. He did understand, and the weight of that understanding was crushing him. As the night wore on, both men found themselves grappling with the fallout in their own ways. For Marcus, it was a question of how to turn this moment into a catalyst for change without losing himself in the process. For Travis, it was about coming to terms with the choices he had made and the consequences he now faced. But neither of them knew that this was only the beginning. Forces beyond their control were already in motion, setting the stage for a reckoning that would test their beliefs, their resilience, and their understanding of what justice truly meant. The city, too, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when everything would finally come to a head. The days that followed were a storm, a relentless whirlwind of scrutiny and pressure that neither Marcus nor Travis could escape. News anchors dissected every second of the encounter, from the moment Travis stepped out of his patrol car to the exact instant Marcus hit the ground. Experts debated, talking over one another about systemic issues, personal accountability, and the blurred lines of intent versus action. The video had gone viral, shared across platforms with millions of comments, some supportive of Marcus, others defending Travis, and far too many fueled by anger and divisiveness. The city, always simmering with tension, was now on the verge of boiling over. For Marcus, life didn't slow down. It became a series of interviews, phone calls, and meetings with community leaders who saw his experience as an opportunity to push for change. His name was being chanted at rallies, his face printed on posters. People he had never met were looking to him as a symbol, a rallying cry for something bigger. And while Marcus had spent his career advocating for reform, this spotlight was different. It was heavier, sharper. He wasn't just a judge anymore. He was the man who had been humiliated, the man who had to stand up for justice when the system faltered. Late one evening, Marcus sat in his chambers, the familiar scent of old books and polished wood doing little to calm his restless mind. The glow of his desk lamp illuminated stacks of letters, some from supporters, others from detractors. But one letter in particular caught his eye. The handwriting was uneven, almost frantic. You think you're better than us because you wear a robe? Stay in your lane, or you'll find out what happens when you don't. Marcus set the letter down, his jaw tightening. This wasn't the first threat he had received, but it felt different this time. It wasn't just an attack on his character. It was a warning, an attempt to intimidate him into silence. He folded the letter and tucked it into a folder, making a mental note to show it to Angela later. But deep down, he knew that telling her would only make her worry more. She was already on edge, constantly reminding him to be careful, to avoid unnecessary risks. Across the city, Travis was facing his own storm. He had been suspended without pay, pending the results of the Internal Affairs investigation. The precinct, once a place of camaraderie and purpose, now felt like a cold, unwelcoming void. Some of his colleagues offered quiet words of support, but others avoided him entirely, unwilling to be associated with the controversy. The whispers followed him everywhere, accusing, dissecting, condemning. He couldn't escape them, not at work, not at home, not even in his own head. He spent his nights staring at the ceiling, replaying the incident over and over again. He thought about the look in Marcus's eyes, the weight of his words. He thought about the crowd, their phones held high, recording every second. And he thought about the moments before he pulled the trigger on the taser, moments where he could have made a different choice, taken a different path. But regret couldn't rewrite history, and now he was left with the fallout. Travis's wife, Emily, tried to be supportive, but even she was struggling. Their small apartment felt suffocating, the walls closing in as the weight of the situation pressed down on them. "Maybe you should talk to someone," she suggested one night, her voice hesitant. "Who?" Travis snapped, the frustration spilling over. "The department, the media. Everyone's already made up their minds." Emily sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I mean a lawyer, or someone who can help you figure out how to move forward." Travis shook his head, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "There's no moving forward from this. My career is over. My life is over." "Stop it," Emily said sharply, her tone cutting through his despair. "It's not over. You made a mistake, yes. But you're not the only one paying for it. What about us? What about this family? You think I don't feel the stares when I go to the store. You think I don't hear what people are saying. But I'm still here, Travis. I'm still fighting for us. So you're going to get to give up. Not now." Her words hit Travis like a punch to the gut. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in days, he saw the toll this was taking on her too. But instead of comforting her, he felt a fresh wave of guilt wash over him. He was supposed to protect her, to protect their life together. And now, because of his actions, everything was crumbling. While both men wrestled with their own battles, the city was becoming a powder keg. Protests were growing larger, more impassioned. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, outside the precinct, outside City Hall. The chants of no justice, no peace echoed through the streets, their rhythm steady and unyielding. For many, Marcus's story was personal. It was their father, their brother, their son. It was a reflection of their own fears, their own experiences. And for every voice calling for change, there was another resisting it, insisting that this wasn't about race, that it wasn't about the system, that it was just one isolated incident blown out of proportion. The divide was growing deeper, the tension thicker. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Marcus and Travis were being pulled in opposite directions, their lives intertwined in a way neither of them had wanted, yet neither could escape. One evening, Marcus received an unexpected phone call. It was from a reporter, someone he knew from past cases. The voice on the other end was calm but insistent. "Judge Steele, I've uncovered something you need to see. It's about Officer Carter." Marcus hesitated, his grip tightening on the phone. "What is it?" "I can't say over the phone," the reporter replied. "But I think it could change the narrative. Meet me tomorrow. Noon. I'll text you the location." Marcus hung up, his mind racing. What could the reporter have found? And what did it mean for the story that was unfolding around him? At the same time, Travis was pacing his apartment, his phone buzzing on the table. It was his lawyer, calling for the third time that evening. Travis ignored it, his stomach churning. He had received his own unexpected message earlier that day. A summons to appear at a public hearing, where he would face both the department's disciplinary board and the public's judgment. The hearing was scheduled for the following week, and already it felt like a noose tightening around his neck. But as much as he dreaded it, a small part of him wanted it to happen, wanted the chance to explain himself, to tell this side of the story. Whether anyone would listen was another matter entirely. Both men were on a collision course, their lives hurtling toward an inevitable climax. The city watched with bated breath, waiting for the moment when everything would come to a head. Neither Marcus nor Travis knew what would happen next, but they both felt the weight of it looming over them. A storm gathering on the horizon, and when it finally broke, nothing would ever be the same. The following morning, Marcus woke early, the reporter's cryptic call still lingering in his mind. The city was quieter than usual at dawn, as if it too was holding its breath. He sipped his coffee slowly, his gaze fixed on the skyline outside his kitchen window. Angela hadn't pressed him for details about the call, though he could tell she was curious. She'd simply kissed his cheek before leaving for her morning yoga class, reminding him to be careful. It wasn't like her to worry so much, but after everything, she had reason to. By noon, Marcus found himself in an old diner on the edge of the city, its retro booths and faded signs a stark contrast to the chaos outside. The reporter was already there, sitting in a corner booth with a laptop and a manila folder. She looked up as Marcus approached, motioning for him to sit. "Thanks for coming," she said, her tone hushed. She glanced around, as if wary of prying eyes. "I know you're a busy man, but this couldn't wait." Marcus nodded, leaning forward. "What's this about?" The reporter opened the folder and slid a document across the table. "I've been digging into Officer Carter's record. What I found, well, it paints a complicated picture." Marcus scanned the document, his brow furrowing. It was a series of internal reports from the police department, each detailing minor infractions, misconduct during traffic stops, complaints from citizens, use of excessive force. None of it had been enough to get Travis dismissed, but the pattern was troubling. "This isn't surprising," Marcus said, setting the paper down. "It fits what we already know about systemic issues in law enforcement. But why bring this to me?" The reporter hesitated, then leaned in closer. "Because this isn't the whole story. There's something else. Something I wasn't expecting to find." She tapped on her laptop, pulling up a video. Marcus's heart sank as he recognized the scene. It was footage from another police encounter, one that hadn't gone public yet. In the video, Travis was restraining a young black man. His voice was calm and measured, even as the man protested. But then something shifted. A senior officer entered the frame, barking orders, escalating the situation. It was clear Travis was uncomfortable, but he complied, stepping aside as the senior officer used force to subdue the man. Marcus watched in silence, his chest tightening. The young man in the video had been unharmed. The scene was eerily similar to his own encounter with Travis. And yet, the context was different. Here, Travis had been following orders, visibly reluctant, but ultimately complicit. The reporter spoke again, her voice tinged with frustration. It's a pattern. Travis isn't the worst of them, far from it. But he's a part of a system that rewards obedience, even when it's wrong. And now he's paying the price for a culture he didn't create. Marcus sat back, his mind racing. He had spent years fighting against this very system, but this new information complicated things. If Travis wasn't the root of the problem, how could Marcus hold him solely accountable? And yet, how could he not? The officer's actions had still led to an abuse of power, one that Marcus had experienced firsthand. Meanwhile, across town, Travis was sitting in his lawyer's office, staring at yet another stack of papers. His attorney, a sharp-tongued man named Reggie, was pacing the room, his voice rising with every word. "This hearing isn't just about you, Travis," Reggie said, gesturing wildly. "It's about the entire department. They're going to throw you under the bus to save themselves. You're the scapegoat, the fall guy." Travis ran a hand through his hair, his head pounding. "I know. I get it. But what am I supposed to do? I can't fight the entire system." Reggie stopped pacing, fixing Travis with a steely gaze. "You fight by telling the truth. All of it. You lay out exactly what happened, from start to finish. And if that means exposing your department's dirty laundry, so be it. This is your life we're talking about." Travis hesitated. He had been loyal to the department, even when it hadn't deserved his loyalty. But now, with his career and reputation on the line, he wondered if that loyalty had been misplaced. As the hours ticked by, the city braced itself for the hearing. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, their signs raised high. Reporters lined the steps, cameras flashing as officials arrived. Inside, the tension was palpable. Marcus sat in the gallery, his presence a silent statement. Travis was seated at the front, flanked by his lawyer and department representatives. The hearing began with testimony from witnesses, each recounting the incident in vivid detail. The prosecutor painted a damning picture, highlighting Travis's record and the systemic issues within the department. But then, just as the momentum seemed to be building against him, Reggie stood and delivered a bombshell. "We have evidence," Reggie said, his voice steady, "that Officer Carter's actions were not isolated. They were part of a broader pattern, one encouraged and perpetuated by the department itself. And we're prepared to show this evidence to the board." The room erupted in murmurs, the tension skyrocketing. Marcus leaned forward, his heart pounding. He hadn't expected this. No one had. The chairwoman of the board banged her gavel, calling for order. "Mr. Carter's lawyer will submit this evidence to the board. However, this hearing is about Officer Carter's conduct, not the department's." Reggie didn't back down. "With all due respect, man, you can't separate the two. Officer Carter's actions are a direct result of a culture that prioritizes compliance over justice." As the board deliberated on whether to admit the new evidence, Marcus's mind raced. This wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't even just about Travis. It was about an entire system, one that was now being laid bare for everyone to see. And as the gavel fell again, signaling the board's decision, Marcus realized that the stakes had never been higher. The air in the hearing room was thick with anticipation as the board allowed Reggie to present the evidence. The lights dimmed slightly as the screen at the front of the room flickered to life. Travis sat stiffly in his chair, his knuckles white, as he gripped the edge of the table. Marcus leaned forward in his seat, his gaze fixed on the screen, unsure of what was about to unfold. The first video played. It showed a training session at the police academy, led by an instructor who seemed more like a drill sergeant than a mentor. The instructor emphasized authority, control, and dominance. Never let them question you, the instructor barked. Your badge is your power, and if you lose control for even a second, you lose everything. The tone was aggressive, the language unmistakable. This wasn't training on de-escalation or community relations. This was a lesson in asserting power, no matter the cost. The second clip was even more damning. It showed a bodycam recording from a senior officer in Travis' precinct. The footage was from a routine stop that had escalated unnecessarily. The senior officer's voice could be heard encouraging younger officers to show them who's in charge, making crude remarks about citizens and how to handle them. Travis's face was visible in the background, clearly uncomfortable but saying nothing. He had followed orders the same as the others. Gasps rippled through the audience as the footage continued. The evidence painted a picture not of a single rogue officer, but of an institutional culture built on fear, power, and unquestioning obedience. Reggie didn't need to say much as the videos ended. The images spoke for themselves. The chairwoman cleared her throat, visibly rattled. "Officer Carter," she said, addressing Travis directly, "do you have anything to add?" Travis hesitated, his throat dry. He glanced at Reggie, who gave him a slight nod. Slowly he stood, his voice barely above a whisper at first. "I joined the force because I wanted to protect people," he began. "I thought I could make a difference. I learned quickly that the department doesn't value protection, it values control. We're taught to see everyone as a threat, to act first and think later. I've seen good officers turn into something they're not because they're afraid of what happens if they don't fall in line. I'm ashamed to say I was one of them." The room fell silent as Travis continued. "What happened with Judge Steele should never have happened. I made a mistake, a terrible one. But I wasn't acting out of hate or malice. I was acting out of fear. Fear of losing my job, fear of disobeying the expectations that were drilled into me from day one. That doesn't excuse what I did, and I take full responsibility. But if this department doesn't change, it's only a matter of time before it happens again." Travis's words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. Marcus felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Anger, sympathy, frustration, all swirling together. Travis had taken accountability, but could words ever repair the damage that had been done? Marcus wasn't sure. The board recessed to deliberate, leaving everyone in the room to stew in their thoughts. Outside, protesters continued to chant, their voices a constant reminder of the stakes. Marcus stepped out into the hallway, needing a moment to clear his head. That's when the reporter from the diner appeared, her face pale. "Judge Steele," she said urgently, pulling him aside. "There's something else. I wasn't going to say anything, but after hearing Travis' testimony, I think you need to know." Marcus frowned. "What is it?" The reporter hesitated, then handed him a printout of an email chain. "It's from a whistleblower inside the department. Apparently, there's been a directive from higher-ups to target prominent figures in the black community. The idea is to send a message. Subtly, of course, but it's clear Marcus Steele was a name on that list." Marcus's breath caught. He scanned the emails, his hands trembling. The directive was vague, carefully worded to avoid overt implications, but the intent was clear. He wasn't just a victim of a random encounter. He had been targeted. His success, his position, it had made him a threat to a system that thrived on inequality. When the board reconvened, the atmosphere was electric. The chairwoman announced their decision. Travis would be dismissed from the force, but the department itself would face a broader investigation. Independent oversight committees would be brought in, and new policies on training and accountability would be implemented. It was a small victory, but it felt hollow to Marcus. The system was still standing, bruised but intact. As the room began to empty, Marcus approached Travis. The officer looked defeated, his shoulders slumped, his eyes downcast. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Marcus extended his hand. Travis looked up, surprised, before hesitantly shaking it. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice heavy with regret. "I know," Marcus replied, "but sorry isn't enough. Not for me, not for anyone. The real work starts now. As Marcus walked out of the courthouse, the weight of the past weeks settled over him. He had won a battle, but the war was far from over. The protesters' chants followed him down the steps, a reminder of the fight that lay ahead. But just as he reached his car, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unknown number. The message read, "Asterisk, this isn't over. Watch your back." Asterisk. Marcus stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. He had exposed the system's flaws, but in doing so he had made enemies, ones who wouldn't rest until they silenced him. The fight for justice was far from over, and Marcus knew that the road ahead would be even more dangerous. But as he looked back at the courthouse, at the crowd still gathered, he felt a flicker of determination. Change was coming, and no threat would stop him from being part of it.